The work on sanity led me back to graduate school, actually, but in a strange way. The magazine was running on a shoestring, and we decided as an editorial group that I wouldn't take any funding from it, any modest funding from it. And so I decided to go back to graduate school as a way of financing working on the magazine. My family would help me a little bit, and then I would get scholarships. And so I went and met Dick Salisbury, who was the head of the Department of Anthropology at the time, and told him about the ideas of pursuing what had become my main interest, the environmental issues in society, and addressing them in a way that looked analytically and conceptually at them from a social science point of view. He said, make an application, finish your outstanding course at Queen's and complete your BA, and I'll see you in the fall. And that's what happened. My first year and my only courses in the summer, after my first year and my only year of courses, I worked in the summer of 1967 with Norman Chance, who was directing the McGill Cree project, a project looking at the southern James Bay Cree communities from a point of view of the impacts of development. It had offices in a separate building, and all the graduate students worked together. And so I did a summer of office work for them, looking at questionnaires, but had the chance to meet all of the extraordinary graduate students who were just finishing their field research and undertaking it. The project, they included Adrian Tanner, Ignatius Laroussic, Peter Sindel, Roger Poitier, Bernard Bernier. And it was a wonderful introduction to anthropology and to thinking about anthropology and working in it. Others who weren't working in the James Bay area but were part of that group were Henry Rutz and Marilyn Silverman. The project itself was about, it called itself a project about developmental change. And it came out of the post-World War II idea or governance form of development, that the world, America was now the world leader, Canada was a partner, the world was underdeveloped, and that created a need for all of the resource exploitation projects that the US needed to happen. In northern Quebec and in Canada, that was being developed or looked at critically to some degree under the Department of Regional Economic Expansion and the ARDA, Area Regional Development Project. So the project was interested in how the Cree were being affected by the mining, the forestry that was developing, and what could be said about the transition they were going through and how it could be responded to. It was aimed at reporting to government, to the federal government. The issues it ended up recommending were the kind you would expect, that governments and their agents needed to be much more trained and about diversity of culture, that there needed to be much more Cree involvement in the opening of the region and the decisions affecting it, and that the Cree themselves needed to have access to assistance and training in order to understand governments better. It was a set of goals that was an attempt to ameliorate and facilitate the transition that was underway. I became interested, I took the environmental issue and developed it through that project. The first summer that I was there, I was invited to write about what an ecological approach to the James Bay region would look like. In the fall that year, I took a graduate seminar with Bruce Trigger, and I was invited to present a paper on what ecological anthropology might be. And Bruce Trigger got very interested in the topic in his work. And in the spring of 1968, I opened the comprehensive exams, and there was ecological anthropology as a major theme. When I look back at what I was saying at that time, it was extraordinarily simple and simple-minded compared to our understandings of today. But in fact, I was educating myself and everyone else to what was really a new topic for all of us. And trying, in some way, I think it was about trying to think through breaking the nature-culture barrier and what that means for anthropology and how one can go about it conceptually and analytically in a way and do research. But we needed even the basics. I remember having to discuss what an ecosystem was, having to think about and then explain what reticulate causality was. All of the sort of starting points of an ecological analysis. Of course, we discovered Rachel Carlson and some of her foundational work in the late 50s on pollution and on what was happening to the seas. But there wasn't much in anthropology yet. There had been traditions, of course, but they weren't engaged in the contemporary environmental issues that were happening in contemporary society. They were about the adaptation of society and agriculturalists, hunters and agriculturalists to their environments. So my MA and PhD projects took on that focus. And I mentioned this moment of intellectual history for two reasons. One, environmental issues have remained central to what I've been thinking about actually all the way through my career. And I think it's because my career was following behind a wider trajectory in society and in intellectual life. On the other hand, it's interesting to remember that at that time, environmental movements were just beginning or expanding and becoming much more widespread. And so take the environmental issue as it moved into its contemporary forms in anthropology was actually, it was possible to link it to, and it was inevitably interacting with what was happening in social movements in society and the developing environmental movement. And so it was an issue that resonated with people naturally, or easily, let me say. My MA thesis was on the boreal forest ecosystem, which is a highly cyclical system of forests burning and recovering, and the important thought of ecological science at the time was that this was actually an integrated system, not a destruction of the forest, but a way of renewing the forest. I became familiar with that and wrote about it and looked at what implications it had for hunters' place in such an ecosystem. I tried to look at long-standing debates on what your means of subsistence could be and put it in the context of a very dynamic environment. And I tried to use that dynamic environment to counter the arguments that the destruction of animal populations was mainly due to indigenous hunters, whereas in fact I was suggesting a changing forest was a very key factor in what was happening to animal populations. So I submitted my thesis. Richard Salisbury, was the assessor for it, and I remember his comments very well. He said it was a very well-developed thesis and worthy of the MA, and that I had reached the wrong conclusion. And I read that a few times and came to understand that what he was really taking me to task for was explaining Cree hunting as something that simply responded to, in a kind of mechanical way, a very dynamic environment, and not in fact creating an account of Cree life and interactions with their world and their environment in a way that made them active participants in the responses and maybe in the environment itself. It became the focus of my PhD, and it opened up in a really clear way for me a much more serious challenge that had to be made to bridge the nature-culture gap. I'm going to stop talking about the PhD, or not start yet, and just close this sort of material on sort of career trajectories, and then come back to talk about the PhD work. When I started writing up my PhD in 1971, I gave a couple of courses at McGill and found that I really liked teaching. It was wonderful to engage with students, and I found it stimulating and thought-provoking almost all the time. I took a 3-year appointment in 1972 at Carleton University in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, just as the James Bay Hydro Project had been announced in 1971, and just as the Cree were mobilizing their opposition to it. And so I started to work with the Cree as I was teaching in my first position at Carleton, which was a very congenial position. 3 years later, in 1975, as the intense negotiations for the James Bay Agreement that I'll talk about in a while, as you could see them coming to an end, there was a deadline for them late in 1975, a position opened at McGill. And I applied for and got the position at McGill for a 3-year appointment, expecting to be able to put in more time and complete my thesis in fairly short order. I knew, though, that the Cree work would have to continue because part of signing a land claims agreement, a treaty, was to establish new institutions of education, health care, management of land, etc. And those institutions would have to be set up quickly after the agreement because you would otherwise have lame duck institutions sitting there while if you did it in a more leisurely fashion. And so the Cree and those people like myself who were working with them as advisors understood that the work would continue into the implementation period. But what caught me by surprise was how intense implementation was, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And so my completion of my thesis, as I was working in the position in McGill, took a longer time than I expected. I really enjoyed the teaching. McGill was a place where many Cree people was studying, and it was a very good home at that time. And I took, at Salisbury's suggestion, applied for and took a Killam postdoc for a couple of years. And then in the early 1980s, took a position at McMaster. And I've stayed at McMaster ever since. It's been a very happy connection. McMaster, at the time I came here, had more northern ethnographers than any other school in Canada, certainly, and any school, I think, outside of Alaska. It also was an extremely congenial department, and it nurtured that congeniality, and it passed it on from generation to generation, making it a very productive place to work. I just would, in reflecting on the time at McMaster, I suppose the highlights of it are really the work with graduate students. Like at McGill, being in a team with graduate students and working together is an extraordinarily productive and dynamic experience. And that happened for several periods at McMaster, when a cluster of graduate students were together, and their work and my work had all sorts of connections. And the first was really from the mid-'80s until into the early '90s. At that time, Catherine Coumans was doing work in the Philippines on Canadian mining companies and their environmental impacts. Taylor Brailsford and Bill Simeon were doing work in Alaska on the new land claims agreement and on subsistence in Alaska. And so there was a real dynamic interaction that was stimulating, I think, for all of us. They went on to long-term careers, each of them mostly in non-academic positions, although with some teaching, and each of them had significant impacts in their work. At the MA level at that time, connected to that partly was doing MAs were Anne Bryden, Brian Cummings, and Sarah Jane Preston. That period shifted in the mid-'90s and into the early 2000s when a new crop of graduate students started working at McMaster. Jasmine Habib, who did work in Israel and Palestine, Matteo Blazer, who did work in Paraguay, Tara Goetze, who did work in Belize, Dawn Martin Hill, who worked with Lubicon Cree, and Wendy Russell, who worked in James Bay, Ontario. This was a much more diverse group, but actually our interests were very similar in terms of dealing with processes of a very dynamic, changing world that some would call globalization, some called transnationalism, some were focused on identity shifts. But it connected well, and it was one of the most stimulating periods for me in my own work, and shifted the kind of work I did, as I'll talk a bit about. Dawn Martin Hill and I founded during that period the McMaster Indigenous Studies program. And all of them were involved, especially Matteo Blazer, Jasmine Habib, Dawn Martin Hill, and Jeeves Harvey Longboat and Matthew Kuncombe in a conference in 1999, which brought together indigenous peoples from South America, North America, and scholars from several countries. It was an extraordinary conference. It resulted in a book called In the Way of Development. But it was a fascinating conference, both because of the balance of scholarly and community voices that was achieved, and because a kind of emergence of central themes around coexistence and around life projects that emerged in the discussions. One very memorable moment and interesting happening was a dozen Haudenosaunee, 6 Nations high school students came in and spent a day at the conference and shared their visions for their community and their visions for relearning their languages, and made an enormous contribution to this sense of direction of all the attendees. And the 2004 volume captures a lot of that. Closer to retirement, I've had graduate students working back in environmental issues primarily. Laura Strachan working in Jordan, Shona McGarvey working in Alberta, both of whom have done intense applied work since. So looking back, graduate students have really been the hub around which a lot of the academic sides of my career have worked, and they've been much of the fun and the personal part of what's happened, although again, it was in a department that facilitated collegiality and collaboration.